My name is Brian Kellerman. I am the Chief Quality and Food Safety Officer at Kellerman Consulting. This is another in our series of ISO 9001 specific webinars. And in the past, we've done ISO 9001 webinars to sort of introduce quality management systems. We've done them to talk about the difference between quality assurance and quality control within a operation. And we've sort of talked about throughout those presentations different aspects of the quality assurance program. Today, we are going to be talking specifically about the review functions in a ISO 9001 program. This is housed in section 9 of the ISO 9001 code. We're going to look with a little specificity at the code, specifically as it addresses these various review functions. Before we jump in to this discussion, I do want to point out that we do have a chat window on the right for anyone that has participated in these webinars in the past. You will know I love when folks participate by putting questions in the chat bar. So if while you're watching this webinar, you have any questions or any specific aspects of reviewing the ISO program, or frankly, any part of the ISO program, if you have a question and you want to type it in, I will stop and I will happily address that question during this webinar. It is the thing I like best about these programs is the ability to be interactive with the audience. So with that said, let's jump in and start to look at what we're going to be talking about here and how we're going to examine this concept of review in an ISO program. Mohammed has said hello. Hello to you, sir. Okay, so the topics we're going to cover here, we have 3 primary review functions. We're going to be looking at frontline reviews in operation. So that's going to line up with section 9.1 of the ISO 9001 code. And these are going to be the actual review functions that we talk about during operation. So whether a facility is making products or whether they are conducting a service, what types of reviews are done while we are completing the operations on a daily or weekly basis. So we're going to be talking about those reviews, and we're going to look at various ways reviews are done and how that would impact ultimately a determination of conformance. But more importantly, beyond just the conformance, we're going to be talking about how quickly that information is relayed from the quality assurance or quality control function back into operations. This is something that's not always considered very carefully by manufacturing or service providing organizations. And we really have an opportunity at even those basic reviews to fundamentally transform how we are running our business and to create efficiencies and improvements in real time. So we're going to look at that. Separately or in conjunction with the reviews in operation, we are going to be talking about internal audits. I do want to point out here, internal auditing is something that we have talked about repeatedly in both webinars. We have a video series up on our website specifically talking about internal auditing. This is the review of reviews, verification of verifications, if you want to think of it in those terms. It is a requirement in an ISO 9001 program. If you just have a quality management system and it doesn't, and you as an organization have not put internal auditing in place, you may not have an internal audit as part of your quality management system. If, however, you are thinking of subscribing to ISO 9001, or if you are already ISO 9001 certified, then you do have an internal audit that must be done on an annual basis as part of the program. The same is true for the management review, the last of the topics that we're going to look at. I quickly want to specify here with management review. So this is a requirement in the ISO code. So in section 9, we have a management review requirement. This is what makes ISO 9001. It's what makes these international programs unique from just having an equality management system, is this requirement that management be involved. So what we see frequently for any businesses that do not have really good deeply embedded quality systems is often a lack of participation from management. And in the ISO 9001 code, we see a requirement that management is participating. There are actually two sections of the ISO 9001 code. Section 5, which is the leadership section, requires that we have leadership participation from top management. It requires an organizational chart that spells out who is going to be reporting to whom and who has responsibility over others. Then, as we get to section 9, that leadership that was defined in section 5 has this review function. So it is like an internal audit. However, an internal audit is performed by the internal audit team and is specifically looking at the ISO 9001 code. And we are actually reviewing documentation down the line against the ISO code to make sure that we are conforming to the requirements of the code and that our documentation is correct. Quickly, as we think through with reviews in operation, on a daily or weekly basis, we will be reviewing the actual data that we have from operations. The internal audit is going to be something done, again, annually at a minimum, but can be broken up over time. But we're going to be checking to see that the data is there, that signatures and things like that are filled out correctly, that nothing is missing. So the internal audit does not itself require that we are reviewing operations, but rather that QA or that the internal audit team is confirming that operations and QA have maintained the correct information, that it is present at the time of the internal audit. Management review, which is performed by leadership or top management, is separate of the internal audit. It should include the internal audit results, and it should be a much higher level assessment that the ISO 9001 program that has been required by top management has been fulfilled by those people who are tasked with carrying out the 9001 program. So here again, we have our frontline reviews, we have our internal audits, we have management review. Before we jump into the reviews and operations, one of the points that you will see in the center column for the internal audit is the critical quality metrics. This is a concept that I have brought forth in multiple webinars and in our video series about 9001. When we're talking about critical quality metrics, those are types of reviews and operations. So we're going to be talking about that in the next section when we're talking about frontline reviews. How do we designate a critical quality metric? Do we even need that in our quality management system? We're going to be talking about internally auditing that critical quality metric, and it's something that we're going to link directly to the internal audit, even though it starts with the frontline reviews. On the third column in management review, you'll notice that we have key performance indicators. These are also concepts that are that we have talked about. I have introduced the critical quality metric. The key performance indicator is a long present terminology in quality management systems and in business. A key performance indicator is some designated part of operations or of the results of operations that senior management, top management is looking at to make sure that the business is functioning correctly. That critical quality metric is a quality measurement in operation that must be correct in order to designate conformity. Key performance indicator is a higher level metric that says our business is properly functioning. And one of the main differences between those two, a key performance indicator may be the amount of money that we are making. It may be the number of customer complaints or feedback that we get per amount of units that we produce or services we provide. Things that are not necessarily operational may not be an actual measurement of quality in the actual operation we're performing. But regardless, a key performance indicator are measurements that have to be correct in order for us to determine that our business is functioning properly. So we're going to be laying these things out in more detail as we go, and we're going to be making sure that we are covering and coordinating these things as we go. Okay, so starting with evaluation and analysis. So the first part of reviewing the program, and again, I just want to remind everyone, we're talking about frontline reviews here. So this is folks in operation performing evaluation and analysis as we go. So in a properly functioning quality management system, ISO 9001 or otherwise, we have a clearly defined process. We should have a process flow chart. We may have a turtle diagram if we're at the planning phase of our program. But one way or the other, we either are making a product or delivering a service, and operations are defined by the process flow and standard operating procedures. Great. While we are carrying out operations for either products or services, we have to have some sort of review of the outputs. And probably, I should say, let's take a step back. You should be reviewing inputs as they come in, and we should be reviewing those, potentially evaluating them to make sure they conform. Then we, throughout our operations, are looking at whatever we do, the changes we make to inputs, or for a service provider, that we have started the service and throughout the stages of that service that we are maintaining conformity, and we have our outputs at the end. As we look at the Section 9 requirements, we are required by the code to lay out what are the evaluation steps that we are taking here. What are the tests? What are the inspections that we have that are going to tell us that things are being done correctly? They can be laboratory testing if we have a lab. We can use statistical process controls if we have a process in which we get data fast enough and that data can be relayed back into operations quickly enough. Then a statistical process control is something that is very much can be a part of our system. As I mentioned, our critical quality metrics are here and would be part of that Section 9.1. And we're going to have potentially confirmations of a service being completed. So that may be a receipt or some kind of report written by the service provider. So when we're talking about evaluation and analysis, if we have a laboratory as part of a manufacturing process, that makes things really easy because we're going to have lab equipment. We are going to be making measurements on the product itself. I started to talk about evaluating inputs and outputs. Well, when we bring in material, if we're talking about a manufacturing site, usually an evaluation and analysis, we can do laboratory testing on incoming materials if we do not have confirmation from the supplier of that material that it conforms to our standards. So if we have a certificate of analysis or a certificate of testing, that can take the place of laboratory testing. If we can't get that information from a raw material supplier, if it's an agricultural product or a raw material straight out of like a mine or something like that, we may need to test it in our own organization. So we may need to have equipment and test it ourselves. Either COA or those lab tests will work. Beyond that, obviously, on the line, we have either, if we have a QC department or if QA and QC are combined, we are probably going to have checks that are made during the building or manufacturing of whatever we're making. So if we have circuit boards, we are probably going to have tests, functional tests of the circuitry and functional tests of the ability of that circuit board and the components to perform the algorithmic functions or whatever it's being programmed to do. And so as we are building it and we do our tests, we can create a paper trail. We can do our checks to make sure that those are working properly. So whether we have a service, whether we have a product, when we are thinking first about reviews in the system, we should make sure that we have a very good understanding of what our reviews are on the line, what types of reviews we're doing, what types of evaluations and analysis, and how important those are in real time to adjusting operations. So with that in mind, assuming that we are not just checking off during the day that we have completed stages, for many types of operations, that's all that's necessary. If I'm building a car, let's say, on an assembly line, at a certain point of the quality assurance checks for the putting together of the engine and the putting the body together, applying paint. Those things are often checked off as completed at part of the stage. And so they reach the end of whatever stage they're in. A quality assurance person will evaluate whether there is an on the line check or just a visual evaluation and check off that it is complete before it reaches the next stage. That information is just confirmation that we're done with this part of the phase of operations, and it can now move to the next step. This slide and what I want to introduce here beyond just do we have checks is the statistical process control and the laboratory analysis, and whether or not we are relaying that information back into operations quickly. And that is something that very sophisticated operations are capable of doing. We love to see that in our from as a consulting standpoint. Any business that has a statistical process control function, that has a working lab, and where those lab results are communicated within the same shift that they are made, and there is the possibility that operations can make adjustments from those recorded bits of measurements or from those metrics, that to me is something that, and for us as a consulting business, we really feel that we can help people get tremendous efficiencies out of their process where that's in place. These are difficult programs to put in place, and they are not required by the ISO code. So ISO 9001 requires that we define the evaluations and analysis that we take. Certainly, we have requirements for any measuring devices that they be calibrated and that we be able to trace them and that calibration for them. So we need to be able to prove that our measurements are accurate and that the devices that made those measurements are understood devices within our operation, and that we are able to prove that we continually check to make sure they work. Beyond that, they really don't tell you what types of checks are required or what types of evaluations or analysis need to be there. The auditor during an ISO audit will ask the facility or the operations to tell them what they're doing and then produce those records as confirmation. As we think about this critical quality metric, that would be any one of these checks, whether it is a statistical process control, whether it's a laboratory analysis, or whether it is a visual inspection. What makes it critical would be one part of our operation and its checks that tells us that we have got all the other checks prior to it correct. So it would be the most representative check of conformance. Or conversely, it could also be a check that is required specifically by a customer or client of ours. So if we are told we must have a specific quality function that is accurate and we have it in writing from a client, we may want to designate that check as a critical measurement or a critical evaluation in process. I would be careful with that second scenario of just, hey, a customer has said that we need to have specific pounds per square inch measurements on pressure function in a device. When we set something as critical, we are saying that this is the first one of the most important measurements that we're going to look at, or evaluations. And when we're thinking about an ISO program, when we think about the review function on the line, any check is important. When we go ahead and designate one as critical above the others, then it is something that might diminish or might confuse our employees or our workers or contractors that some of these other checks are less important. And that's not really what's intended here. Where we have, as I say, a circuit board that has been built, each of the sub checks, so each of the checks at the stages leading to the completion of the board might, they're all equally important, but we may have a critical check at the end to perform, let's say, a mechanical action based on that building of the circuitry board. And we can call that last check critical, because even though each check leading up to it is just as important as that check of functionality, if there is a problem with the board, the functionality check would be the place that would be the most representative of it. And it would require us to then go back through our process and try to understand where the error occurred. And then if it's possible to do a corrective action on that board, we would do it at that critical phase before it moves on to, let's say, final packaging. I do want to also mention here, I think a little bit more clearly with the statistical process controls. We have done as a webinar statistical process controls, and those can be found on our website. I don't want to go all the way through what a statistical process control is. It's going to take a little bit too much time to unpack all of it. But what I want to say with a statistical process control is in real time, where we have functions like a filling function, and that would be like for liquids, what we find is that you can measure throughout the operational run the status of a check. And if we're able to link that specific evaluation to a maintenance function or to an operational function that's adjustable, based on the real-time readings we are getting from that measurement, we can go back on the line and make adjustments. So when we talk about statistical process controls, and of course you can get into very fancy versions of this like Six Sigma, what we're really thinking about, though, is how quickly we are able to get that data back into operations. So if I am measuring a fill function, if I have a volume or density function as part of what I'm making, or if a service is being done and I can keep track of, let's say, a timing function of it, and through our recording of data in real time, we can go back and communicate to other people in operations, and they are going to, for a manufacturing facility, pull out a wrench, pull out a screwdriver, and start tinkering with machinery to get the evaluated results back into a specification or to adjust it to achieve an efficiency. That is where a statistical process control is in place. And that's obviously a specialized form of review and analysis. As I mentioned, if I'm just checking a circuit board at the end of a process, how quickly someone reviews that check isn't necessarily that important. If it works, great. It moves on to final packaging, and we are going to be selling, packaging, storing, and shipping that product. If I am making something that has a time element or a time specific element to it, and I have the ability to go back into operations and tweak equipment or tweak the operations to adjust the results, now I have a tremendous amount of control over how I'm dealing with operations. So as I said previously, when we see folks that have a statistical process control or a series of them in place, usually that facility is able to perform that QC or QA function and in real time let someone know what the results are and give instructions to make adjustments as they go. And that would be one of the higher functions here. For laboratory analysis, and again, laboratory analysis can be the source of a statistical process control, where we are doing lab testing as part of final confirmation of a process, whether we are linking that directly to maintenance or operations to have them go out during the same shift and make changes to equipment, or we are simply reviewing that information at the end of the process and confirming that we manufactured to conformity or that a service was provided correctly. The laboratory function itself, we still have an opportunity to think through how quickly we are doing that review function. And one of the main takeaways I wanted to have of this webinar is for everyone here to think through what your reviews are on the line and how quickly folks are actually evaluating that within the organization. And in an ISO 9001 program, we really want to think through how quickly are we communicating those results to other parts of the organization to affect some kind of either improvement to the system, non-conformance corrective actions, or other types of changes. We always are looking for, I am always looking for in a project, how quickly QA, QC are relaying that information to operations. Where we see it done quickly and when there's really good communication, you are going to see the evaluation and analysis function of that frontline operations have a real meaningful effect on how the company functions and our ability to have a really strong 9001 program. So with that said, when we put aside the frontline evaluations and we think about internal auditing of the ISO 9001 program, this is section 9.2 of the ISO 9001 program. So 9.1 was the evaluation and analysis. As we look at internal auditing, and again, we've done this, we have several lengthy video series on internal auditing, and we have webinars about it as well. So if you want more background as to what an internal audit is and how to properly perform one, please feel free to go to our website. Those are free and available. I think they're also on YouTube as well. But assuming that we have an internal audit, or we're already ready to start to plan an internal audit, I do want to remind folks, we do need to have the ISO 9001 book itself. We should be performing the internal audit to the code. So if you are in a 9001 program, make sure you have that 9001 book. And I do want to say I've had multiple projects where the facilities are confused as to whether or not they should have the 9001 code. They absolutely, the 9001 code is something that you should have as part of your program. So if you don't have that book, you should go purchase it. ISO 9001 is in the entire ISO program, they are very, very aggressive about making sure that folks have purchased that book. They're kind of expensive, but one thing that we see is in our work with 9001 programs, in the old days, it's kind of been old-fashioned to sort of share those books. And so you actually have a culture of confusion around whether or not the book should be used or not. We have seen instances where outgoing QA managers are telling the new incoming people, don't show them the ISO 9001 book. I've worked with at least one client that was confused as to whether they should have it, but what they were being told by their predecessor is, hey, I have a off the books version of this and don't show it to an auditor, and that person misinterpreted it as I'm not allowed to have the book itself in the audit. We absolutely are. We absolutely should be using it as the basis of our internal audit. And when we are internally auditing, we have our internal audit team, whether that's one person or multiple people. We're taking those frontline reviews that we've been doing. So our statistical process controls, our laboratory analysis, the critical quality metrics, that whether we've designated them or not, we are going to definitely make sure we internally audit those. And we are not rechecking every single test result that we've done. When we are internal auditing, we need to go through our operations and make sure that the data is there, that those reviews are done, that we had sign-offs, the calibrations that we talked about at the beginning, that those calibrations are also done along with the actual results themselves, so that we can confirm the measuring devices were accurate and traceable, that we have correct results coming out of those measuring devices, that we have had the appropriate reviews. And again, if we are relaying that information quickly to operations, we would want to confirm that the reviews are relayed and communicated properly in the time frame that we need for a functioning operation. So when we are performing the internal audit, we are going carefully through our code, making sure that we have all of our documents for 9001 as we get to the operations section. So when we're looking at section 8, when we get into section 9, the actual evaluation piece, that all of the data is there and in good order. Now, we mentioned critical quality measurements. I know I mentioned key performance indicators at the beginning. We're going to bring this back in here now because I want to talk about with the internal audit. And I want to be thinking through the fact that we are going through the code carefully, clause by clause, requirement by requirement, confirming that we either have the evidence that conforms to the requirements of the code, or we're finding non-conformances and fixing them. Where we are looking at evaluations of the frontline actions, so where we are looking at laboratory results, statistical process controls, if we have critical quality measurements, so if we have those parts of our operation and QA, we do have a designation that something is critical. That should be really where we're starting our internal audit of the review function. Now, the critical quality measurement has already been designated as critical. So if that's the case, we should be doing a review on that as those results come in, and they should be carefully checked on the front line. For the internal audit, we are confirming that those critical measurements are still there, that those sign-offs were done correctly, that we're not missing anything. So we should be seeing and would expect to see conformance in our critical quality measurements. But we want to start there. It is critical. And during the internal audit, we want to make sure that we've evaluated that we haven't missed that in operation. For key performance indicators, what we are thinking about here, and it's on this slide, is we can be superficial when we're thinking about those top line or bigger picture measurements that we're making on whether the company is functioning properly or not. So again, if I have a profitability key performance indicator and I am liaisoning with the chief financial officer on making sure that we as a company are getting our revenue reports, and that revenue, once all of the costs and other financial aspects are taken out, that our profitability is being maintained, if that's our key performance indicator. We don't, as an internal audit, necessarily need to go into a lot of detail about that. It's not to say that key performance indicators are not important. They are very important, but really senior manager, top management during the management review should be really digging into key performance indicators. Here at the internal audit, we are really spending our time and effort looking carefully at the critical quality measurements. Was the math correct? Was the person recording those values? Did they record them correctly? We might want to inspect the training records of the people that are taking the critical quality measurements, those critical quality metrics. We are really examining that carefully at the internal audit. And we're doing that because those measurements and the data have to be correct in order for us to make sure that the entire ISO 9001 program is functioning properly and that we're ready to send that into audit for the annual audit that's done of the program. For the KPIs, the internal audit team should not necessarily be spending excess amounts of time on KPIs. When we're thinking about key performance indicators, and for those of you that have KPIs in your system, they may have some they almost certainly are going to have mathematical formulas. What we want to make sure is if we have an Excel spreadsheet, that the mathematical formulas still work. If we have links towards other documents, that those links are not broken. So at a superficial level, we can certainly look to make sure that the baseline information that's going to get to top management is in place for our KPIs. But the internal audit team doesn't necessarily need to spend a lot of time on whether those KPIs are correct. So just to reiterate here, we're not saying that those key performance indicators are not important, but rather the management review function should take care of it here. And we will see with management review that those critical quality measurements can be handled at a superficial level, as long as the internal audit really focused on evaluating how we are collecting those measurements, that the people who are collecting them are trained properly, that the information is being recorded accurately on calibrated equipment, and that we have all of the sign-offs that are required for those critical quality measurements. So when we are thinking about, as an overview, the internal audit, like what we're going to do with all of this, we have our critical quality measurements that we are going to be very carefully looking at. We have our key performance indicators that we're going to make sure the prerequisite functions for it, the mathematical equations, the dashboard, if we have them for top management, that those things are functioning properly in preparation for the senior management review of those key performance indicators. We should have our internal audit records and results. we are going to make sure at the end of the internal audit that any non-conformances will have corrective actions, and or corrections depending on what the error we find in it. If we find something that's just missing a signature, we may just need to have a correction, which is to have someone sign that document. Whether it requires also a corrective action. If we see a series of the same errors, we may want to elevate it to a corrective action. If we find meaningful deviations that are unacceptable, certainly anything that is wrong with a critical quality measurement or critical quality metric should have a correction and corrective action immediately. And that should be a major issue that is brought up through internal audit. All of those non-conformance findings and the corrective actions, those need to be a part of the final internal audit report, and those are going to be presented to management. And that is going to be part of what top management is looking at as part of their review. So when the internal audit has been done correctly, when we've reviewed all of those frontline measurements, when we've covered all of the critical quality measurements and critical quality metrics and made sure that those are accurate, when we've recorded all of the findings of our internal audit against the entirety of the ISO 9001 code, and we've managed our corrective actions, corrections, and non-conformances, and those are a part of the report, they are ready to send over to top management. Now, one thing that I want to mention here, the timing of an internal audit versus the timing of a top management review. So we need to, as part of our internal audit, confirm that our management review functions match our requirements for the 9001 code. But conversely, management review needs to include finalized internal audits. So we are at slightly a bit of a conundrum as far as what's the best way to handle it. It would be nice during an internal audit to be able to take management reviews that are recent and include that as part of our internal audit to look for conformance of the management review function. However, most often internal audits, if they're going to come first, we're just going to make sure that our policy and procedure, any written methods and responsibilities for top management are up to date and accurate. And we can take any of the most recent records. So if we only have one management review a year, we might have to use last year's management review, and that would be fine. However, what we also see is breaking up of internal audits, and we see breaking up of management reviews throughout the year. So I may have 2, 3, or 4 internal audit events. I may have 2, 3, 4, or possibly as many as 12 management reviews if we do them monthly. Certainly, if management reviews include weekly assessments, and we do see that in programs, and I might have dozens of them. An internal audit should most likely come first in the cycle of a 9001 program, or at least completion of the internal audit should come first. Every time I complete one of those internal audits, they go to top management. So that's one of the main functions of the management review, is reviewing this completed internal audit. So most likely I'm going to do the internal audit prior to the final management review. And I would expect that the internal audit has very carefully reviewed those critical quality measurements, and that all of those are being confirmed and presented to top management for that review. To go along with those critical quality measurements, again, we have all of our frontline reviews and a synopsis. Part of the internal audit is representative records have been reviewed, and we either find that they are accurate and easily retrievable, or that we couldn't find them, that they were incomplete, that we were missing things, and we have this corrective action to go along with that. That's all going to be compiled. So that's what we're looking to find by the end of an internal audit. And then we are going to be passing those over to management review. And with that, let's dig into management review. What is it that we're trying to achieve with management review? Again, much like the internal audit, we said the internal audit needed an internal audit team. Management review requires that representative figures from top management are participating, whether that is the CEO, COO, CFO, any of those C-level organization, positions in an organization, or if we have presidents and vice presidents, people at that level, possibly we may have managers or directors that are designated top management. When we're doing the ISO 9001 program, as I mentioned, Section 5 is leadership, and part of that is designating who are the people at the top of the organization that represent management, the top management of the ISO 9001 program. Those people need to know that they are designated as top management. They need to take their responsibility seriously. And first and foremost is going to be participating in this management review. For anyone that has participated in any of our previous webinars, watched any of our videos, one of the things that you'll know is, for me personally, one of the messages that Kellerman Consulting delivers is when leadership participates, you have usually a very good quality system. So I personally am adamant, our company really pushes strongly towards, and I would expect anyone looking to or wanting to have the best possible quality management system, effective, aggressive, and accountable leadership that is aggressive but supportive, and ideally friendly and helpful and responsible leadership that is participating on an ongoing basis, not just swooping in once a year to do a management review, that may go onto the line personally and just see what kinds of quality checks are being done. If we have critical metrics in our system, they may go take a look at those critical quality metrics and make sure that folks are doing them correctly, even though they're not a part of the internal audit team. But ultimately, as we narrow down and think through what the top management function is, it certainly is most important when we get to this management review. And when we are looking at the entirety of our ISO 9001 program, including the internal audits, making sure that our program functioned correctly. And this should be a big picture. If we have a very strong system of frontline checks of our outputs, so if we have laboratory checks, if we have statistical process controls, if we have check sheets for QC and QA on the line, we have ongoing proof that our system conforms. When we perform the internal audit, we now have that master verification activity confirming the presence of all that information and that it is current, accurate, and conforms to the 9001 standard. So here now, top management does not need to go and start that process over and do an entire elaborate review of all of the information. Management review should be an efficient, high-level review, should be focusing a little, at least on the bigger picture functionality of the program. So when we are looking at operations, we need to confirm that operations is working as intended, that we have provided adequate resources, that any continuous improvement projects are still in place, that the people we have running the quality department, whether it's QA or QC, are meeting their responsibilities and working correctly with operations, and that the outcome of our program is working correctly. I want to stress here the financial aspect once more, because it is top management that ultimately controls the financial decision-making of the business. And when we're doing management review, one of the critical differences between an internal audit and management review is the fact that the top management has an awareness of the physical health, the financial health of the business, and an ongoing understanding of revenues, profitability, compensation, bonuses, things like that. And at that top management review, we're going to be able to contextualize that information that we see from the front line and from the internal audit. As I mentioned in the last slide, every internal audit must be presented to senior or to top management for the management review. So when we're doing top management review, included in that is whatever internal audits have already been done. As we just mentioned, that includes a very careful understanding of critical quality metrics from the front line, all those laboratory analysis. So the internal audit already took care of it. Management review is not going to need to go through and reevaluate all of those measurements to make sure they're correct, we can be superficial. And by that, I just mean we're going to confirm that those measurements were internally audited and that we're okay. We see conformance at an appropriate level. So we do not need to be spending lots of extra time on critical quality metrics in the same way that we mentioned that about KPI reviews during internal audit. So you see here, this is where our symmetry is. The internal audit, we're digging deep into the critical quality metrics, frontline reviews. Management review, we're going to be digging deep into the KPIs, the key performance indicators. We don't have to spend an excessive amount of time relitigating or reevaluating those critical quality metrics because we already did that. The internal audit team already did it. If we want to spend time evaluating or at least looking at the functionality of our internal audit team, whether they are properly trained, whether they had enough understanding of those metrics to evaluate it during internal audit, so be it. That would still be somewhat of a superficial review of it to say, are my evaluators properly trained, while not necessarily having to dig deep into those evaluations. Now, I suppose if I'm doing a management review and I find out that my quality assurance manager is not properly trained, if I do not believe they have performed the internal audit function correctly, top management may go ahead and drill down into the data to confirm whether or not there's suspicions of the qualifications of the internal auditor or the quality assurance manager. That may result into an exception in which top management does drill down into it. But in a properly functioning ISO 9001 program, we would be expecting that this was done correctly and that for top management, we are just trying to make sure and confirm this was done correctly. As we begin to wind things down, we're getting pretty close towards the last 10 minutes, which we like to hold for a Q&A. I just want to sort of go back quickly and say, with these KPIs, if we're thinking from the top down, with key performance indicators, and for those of you who are listening, if you know what your KPIs are as a business, that's very important. It should be linked up to either your quality policy in your program or the quality objectives in section 6. So we should have an understanding of what our KPIs are. But again, if we're in the quality department, you may not be able to recall your KPIs quickly. If you are a top manager in a business, you should be able to have a pretty quick recall of what your KPIs are. If you are in top management and a part of top management review, those KPIs should be something that you have spent a lot of time looking at, considering, using to make high-level decisions about what the quality system is going to look like going forward. It should help us evaluate whether our continuous improvement projects have been working properly. It should be indicative of whether our communication within the organization is healthy and appropriate, that we have a high-level culture of quality in our facility or in our operations. If we don't have a facility, it may be remotely. When we think through that key performance indicator evaluation, as a top level manager, I should be really spending a lot of time thinking through what I'm evaluating, having a real honest discussion with other top management about how we're functioning based on what we see with those KPIs. Certainly, if we have any failures of a KPI, that means that our business is in tremendous trouble because a KPI, a key performance indicator, something that should not have violations to it. Those are they are key, and they are telling us that our business is functioning properly. So anytime we see anything even getting close to failures of a KPI, that should immediately trigger a major evaluation of what we're doing and whether our business needs to ultimately adjust at fundamental levels to regain functionality for the quality management system. When we're thinking down to the internal audit, again, those KPIs should be considered at the top. When I'm thinking about it at the middle level of an internal audit, I'm thinking through making sure that we are reviewing our collection of data, those critical quality measurements, and that we ultimately are finding that the people who are performing the frontline functionality, the frontline reviews, that those folks are properly trained, using correct equipment, and that it lines up with operations. Through my internal audit, I should be able to identify pretty clearly that the data that is collected and reviewed, the evaluations, whether in the lab or just through on the line reviews, that information is being relayed to operations quickly enough to be usable within the context of how we relay that information. And if we have any statistical process controls or any type of evaluations that alter operations in real time, that communication in the facility is strong and that it is adequate to getting those changes done in real time. And lastly, at the fundamental level of our organization, that we have quality control or quality assurance folks that understand what those measurements that they need to be taking or overseeing are, that they understand how to work lab equipment properly, and that they are empowered to communicate anything that is not going correctly up the chain back towards top management. If we have all of those things in place with our review function, we really should have a very strong quality assurance program. We should be easily able to present this information during an ISO 9001 audit, and we should expect to get certification. With all of that said, I want to leave a little bit of time to see if anyone had any questions or comments that they would like addressed as part of this webinar. We made it all the way through. I didn't see any questions as we went, but if anyone was saving one till the end, I want to give us a couple minutes to leave time for that. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to wait about 30 seconds to a minute to see if anyone wants to type any of those in. While I'm waiting, I do want to say, obviously, you have contact information here. If you heard anything during this webinar or it jogged any ideas and you have any questions, you are able to communicate with us. We are happy to discuss any of these issues for anyone who wants to call into our organization or send us an email. We're happy to discuss these things. All right. I'm not seeing any questions in the immediate. If you have any, remember, feel free to give us a call or an email. Otherwise, please enjoy the rest of your day today. Those of you who are watching this video, we hope everything is going well wherever you are and whenever you're watching this. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.